This may be controversial, but yep, that's a completely coherent sentence in Cantonese. Now listen to this Mandarin sentence. 是是是十是十十是是十四四十是十是 A bunch of one-syllable words that are almost spelled exactly the same, and while it might sound stupid and confusing and killed my brain to read that, these sentences actually make instant sense to any Chinese speaker, and this is actually what makes Chinese absolutely brilliant. How though? And what do those sentences even mean? Well, first off, we need to understand what syllables are and what they do. Think of it as the building block of language. It's the smallest unit of sound that forms part of a word. Every time you say a word, you're breaking it down into syllables without even realizing it. Syllables not only help us pronounce words, but they also give our language structure. Let's take the word butterfly. Split it into syllables. Butterfly. And suddenly it's easy to see how these sounds, butterfly, come together to create meaning. English speakers rely on over 10,000 syllables to express everything from hello to anti-disestablishmentarianism. Whew, I can't believe I got that on my first try. That's a lot of variety, and it's what allows us to distinguish words easily in conversation. Now imagine a language where there aren't thousands of syllables to play with though. Imagine if every word you said had to be built from just a few hundred syllables. Ooh-ah, boo-ba. Sounds impossible, right? Ooh-ba, boo-ba, ba-boo-ba-boo, ooh-ba, ba. Wouldn't everything start sounding the same eventually? Well, you're right. Mandarin has around 1,300 syllables, and Cantonese has 2,200, and less than half of them are commonly used, which means Chinese people are only communicating with only hundreds of syllables. That's why go 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 sounds like pure gibberish made up of identical sounds. So how are Chinese speakers communicating complex ideas like AI and science with only hundreds of syllables? How does this not lead to massive confusion? Well, it does. Let's look at this famous one-syllable article called Lion Eating Poet in the Stone Den, or in Mandarin, 十是十是十是是十是十是十. If you say this to any native Mandarin speaker, I can guarantee you that no one will understand what you're saying. Now you might be thinking, okay, if having more syllables makes it easier to communicate, then why don't they just add more syllables like we have in English? The truth is, Chinese people don't need to. And to understand why, let's first understand how a Chinese syllable is formed. You see, there's actually a formula. It's made up of 3 parts: an initial, a final, and a tone. Let's take the word, for example, from the article, 是, as an example. The initial is sh, just make a sh sound without voicing any vowel, okay? The final, meaning the last letter, is I, making it sh together. And finally, it has the second tone. I'll get more into tones later. So the pronunciation of this character together is sh. Now in Cantonese, there are 20 initials, 60 finals, and 6 tones, or 9, depending on how you find them. In Mandarin, there are 22 initials, 36 finals, and 4 plus 1, 5 tones. And so if you do the math, the total number of syllables in Cantonese would be 20 times 60 times 6, which is Asian math mode, 7,200, and in Mandarin, 22 times 36 times 5, 3,960. That's actually a decent amount of syllables, except more than half of them don't exist. Taking Cantonese, for example, the initial N exists, like nei, and up is a vowed final in words like fo. But take that N and the up, nook, nope, not a thing. It sounds like it could work, but it doesn't exist in the language. Now jump over to Mandarin. The initial G exists, for example, in the word ge, and the final I is super common too, as in the word li. But G, nope, doesn't exist either. And so not every initial can go with every single final. It's like having all the right ingredients for a recipe, but the dish just isn't on the menu. You have all the ingredients for a lot of syllables, but the corresponding words just don't exist. And so you're thinking, what's wrong with Chinese people? Can't they just use these syllables? Why don't they just use nook? Well, there's a reason, and we'll get into that. But first, what's the actual number of syllables in use? Well, in Cantonese, as I said, around 2,200. Now, if you think Cantonese is a minimalist, in Mandarin, 1,300 syllables only, and only 410 are commonly used. Just compare that for a second to English, which uses over 10,000 syllables. How many have I used in this video already, right? So now, the reason there aren't more syllables in Chinese is simple. The system works. Instead of loading up on syllables, Chinese leans on tones to stretch the ones that it has, turning a small pool of syllables into a flexible, efficient way to communicate tons of meaning. And honestly, it's kind of genius. If you've ever tried to speak Chinese, you probably know that tones are where things get interesting. In Mandarin, for example, the syllable ma can mean 4 completely different things depending on the tone. Mother, ma, hem, kidding. Ma, horse, ma, or skull, ma. Now you might be thinking, tones, okay, we don't have that in English. Well, actually, we kind of do. Take the word, for example, progress versus progress. Same letters, same basic sound, but the meaning changes depending on how you say it. I'm making progress on this project versus I need to progress to the next level of this video game before I throw my controller against the wall. See? Different stress, different meaning. Now imagine that same concept, except 100 times more precise. In Mandarin, the same spelling can have 4, sometimes 5 different sounds. Let's look at shi again. If you say in the first tone, shi, it means lion. Say in the second tone, shi, and now it means 10. Drop your voice for the third tone, shi, and suddenly talking about history. Or it could also mean poop. We'll get into that later. Use the fourth tone, shi, and I'm talking about a matter or affair. So if you use the wrong tone actually, you could be talking about poop instead of important matters to a business partner. Yep, that's Chinese. And you can imagine how many more potential awkward situations you can create in Cantonese where there are 6 tones. And so with all these tones, you'd think everything would be crystal clear, right? Well, not exactly. Because even with the perfect tone, history and poop read shi and shi in Cantonese and Mandarin, and si and si in Cantonese and Mandarin still sound exactly the same. So what's stopping someone from saying poop instead of history? I think this is Chinese people's way of saying that history is poop. Who cares about history? But that's where 词语, or character combinations, come to the rescue to stop you from saying poop instead of history. See, with so few syllables, homophones, characters that sound exactly the same, are really hard to avoid in Chinese. But here's the kicker. For native speakers, they always know when it's history and when it's poop. How? Well, in Chinese, a character isn't necessarily the same thing as a word. It's like the word hose in English. Are we talking about a garden hose, or are we dealing with pantyhose? See, you wouldn't know without some context in front, right? Sometimes a character by itself in the same way might not even mean anything, or it might be super vague. And so how do we kind of turn these characters into something that's meaningful, something that has more use? Well, it's just like adding garden or panty in front of hose, right? Chinese words are like building blocks. A character by itself might not mean anything, but once you put different blocks together, you get words that actually mean something. For example, 历史 or 历史 equals history. Past history equals history. 来洗 or 拉屎, to pull a poop, meaning to poop. And so interestingly enough, you'll rarely see the characters 洗 as in history and 洗 as in poop individually by itself. It'll normally be accompanied by something to give more meaning. And so now there's no confusion there, right? And that's why when there are confusions or potential misinterpretations in Chinese, we normally clarify it with a 词语, a character combination. For example, when I say my Chinese name, 郝家瑩, people always go, oh, 边個瑩? Which wing are you talking about? And I'd say, okay, 永恆嘅瑩. It's like saying cell as in prison cell, not like buy and sell. And so every word is built like this in Chinese. Take the word, for example, 電腦 or 電腦. Literally translates to electric brain, but it actually means computer. Or 飛機, 飛機, flying machine. Now that's a pretty straightforward description. Way cooler than just saying plane, right? And my personal favorite is avocado, which can either be 咬油果, meaning butterfruit, describing the flavor, or 鳄梨, crocodile pear, describing the appearance. So once you start stacking characters together, the meaning becomes crystal clear, even if the pronunciation is the same. And it's almost impossible to mix things up. Keyword there, almost. Because there are still combinations that sound exactly the same. Like for example, 逝世, meaning to pass away, and 世事, meaning the affairs of the world. Or in Cantonese, 西安, which means private, while 西安 means poet. Now you may think, well, I mean, English does this too, right? Right? True, but in Chinese this happens a lot more often. It's like English, but homophone steroids. Think of if every single sentence had the word bear, right. With fewer syllables and a whole lot more meaning packed into every single sound. How do they minimize confusion? Well, context is, as always, king. But what provides ultimate clarity is written characters. For example, all pronouns in Mandarin have the exact same pronunciation, ta, but with just a glance at the character, you know exactly if you're talking about a him, her, or it, an animal, or a deity. Problem solved. Now the 是是 article finally makes sense. 是是是是是是是是是是是是 In a stone den was a poet called Shi who was a lion addict and had resolved to eat 10 lions. The person who wrote that, I hate you. But having written characters doesn't change the fact that spoken Chinese has very few syllables. And so with all these homophones and limited syllables, you might be thinking, isn't this just a giant puzzle waiting to confuse everyone? Surprisingly, no. In fact, having fewer syllables is kind of like a secret weapon. Think of it like this. If language is a game of chess, English might be playing with 100 different pieces, each one doing its own thing, but Chinese is playing the same game with just a few pieces, yet every piece has multiple moves thanks to tones and context. It's an elegant system of efficiency. Fewer syllables might sound like a limitation, but in reality for Chinese, it's a superpower. It forces you to use each syllable strategically, layering tones and context to create a precise and flexible way of communicating. So why doesn't Chinese have more syllables? Well, we don't need them. Chinese takes the syllables it has and stretches them to their full potential using tones and character combinations to really just add layers of meaning that are instantly recognizable to native speakers. Instead of expanding the syllable count, it refines what it already has, creating a language that's rich, efficient, and unique on its own. In the end, fewer syllables aren't a drawback. They're a feature that makes Chinese one of the most fascinating languages in the world. And that's why having fewer syllables in Chinese isn't just okay, it's kind of brilliant. Oh, and that sentence, that means that brother is taller than that brother. Brilliant, isn't it? Now click here if you want to learn the hidden reality about why Chinese can't have an alphabet, and click here if you're a Cantonese speaker who wants to learn Mandarin. 再见.